Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Savings You Can Bank On. Today, we're going to cover a case study on BMO-Harris Bank, and we'll talk about how they achieved significant cost savings, over $10 million, through their data archiving and application decommissioning program. My name is Julie Fook. I head up marketing here at Flatirons Digital Innovations. We are a content and data consulting and implementation provider, and we specialize in what we like to consider particularly complex information challenges that our clients have. Our clients tend to be larger organizations in heavily regulated industries. Let me go ahead and introduce today's presenters. We have George Florentine and Jim Monaco. George is our head of technology and engineering here at Flatirons Digital Innovations, and he heads up working with our teams to make sure that our engagements with clients are successful, both to help achieve business goals and technology requirements. And George has a particularly outstanding skill in being a technologist who can communicate with the rest of us. So it's a pleasure to have him hosting today. And Jim Monaco has a very seasoned career in information management, working with a number of clients, both in financial services and other industries. And his expertise is really across the board, working to design, develop, implement, and also support information solutions. So welcome to both of you today. And George, I'll kick it over to you.
Well, great. Thanks, Julie. And thank you, everyone on the phone, for joining us today. And Jim, my esteemed colleague, thank you. It'll be fun to talk for the next little while. We'll probably try and chat for about 35 minutes or so. Jim and I, we're going to talk to you about the great work that Jim and the BMO-Harris team has done, and then we'll definitely have time for questions. We have an online chat available, so for anyone who has questions throughout the program, please put us in chat, and at the end, Julie will be our facilitator and will coordinate having those questions addressed. So let's get going. Agenda. So we're going to talk about what we see as sort of data archiving drivers and what BMO-Harris drove them to create their program. Then they'll talk about a particular engagement, which was our first one with them back in the mid-2000s. Talk about archiving requirements. Something that's going on for a number of years. So Jim will walk us through the various applications they've decommissioned over time and what that kind of rhythm has looked like, and the value, the return on investment for BMO. And we'll also sprinkle in some conversations that aren't particularly relevant to financial services. Obviously, BMO's in that vertical, but we think there's applicability to energy and gas and oil, to high-tech manufacturing, to other verticals. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So BMO-Harris, very strong bank here in North America, was especially strong and resilient during the financial downturn and kind of troubles in 2007 and 2008. And as the industry started to recover from that, BMO recognized that they had an opportunity to provide some added value to their customers and to the financial community in general through a number of M&As. So in 8, 9, 10, 11, they went through a number of M&As, also did quite a bit of organic growth during that time. So you can see their numbers: over 700 branches, north of $195 billion in assets they manage. Headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, understanding they're building a new property in Chicago, so exciting times for them. And just due to some scheduling conflicts, we couldn't get through. The BMO team couldn't be on the phone with us today, but they've reviewed all this and are obviously a great ongoing customer for ours, so we're happy to chat about them. Background of how we got engaged with the team: 2010, as I mentioned, they started to do a number of M&As. And as they did these M&As, they realized, like, we have a number of systems that are now redundant, but we can't just turn them off. We have to have them, whether they're an HR system, whether they're a legacy financial system, whether they're an operational system, and hence the need for some business continuity, both for legal reasons and for operational excellence. And so they pretty quickly realized this. And one of their leaders in this part of the organization, Todd Sesto, who's a colleague and friend of ours, noted that because they're in this regulated industry, they have retention requirements that range from 7 all the way up to 40 years. And as Jim will mention when he talks, it's not only retention, but it's purge over time. It's not just hold on to the data somewhere, but manage the data operationally over that period. So that's an important part of of how we helped the team. And as I mentioned, they do have a successful history of M&A as well as organic growth. And so especially with the M&As, they realize that as they get each one, their complexity goes up. And as we all know, IT sometimes can kind of bog down in managing complexity. And the business side to say, I want you to be a partner with me. I don't want you to just incur ever increasing costs and have your velocity be reduced. You can't help me get into new markets. You can't help me do innovation because you're spending more and more money keeping the lights on. So Todd and the other leaders at BMO-Harris recognized that they had to have a program to address this, and that's how this program got started. So they created this program called Data Retention and Decommissioning. It's been running since about 2010, still in operation today. And really what they looked at as they acquired these new companies, they have a very, I think, mature and sophisticated application rationalization program where they look at these new applications and say, we've just done M&A. They have an HR system. Are we going to continue with that? Are we going to merge it into our HR system? Are we going to turn that off? We have to hold on to the data for legal reasons and also our commitment to our employees. And so they've developed a comprehensive exit strategy for how to manage these. As I mentioned before, they have retention requirements, also business continuity requirements. They don't want to do an M&A. Obviously, when they bring in these new companies, I think BMO is a very employee and customer-centric organization. So they want to make sure these new employees are valued and that they have access to their old systems. That, you know, I don't get, I'm in a bank that gets acquired by BMO. I call up 2 years and say, I need to look at something in my HR history. They don't want to say, oh, we don't have that. They want to provide that continuity. And of course, there's a bunch of requirements from a legal perspective as well. And so they really got this going in 2012, and it's ongoing today. So that's kind of the landscape I wanted to lay out for you. I've been involved with BMO since the early days, but Jim's actually the person who's been doing the work. And so I wanted to transition to Jim, who will walk us through one of the first projects, and then onward over the period of time. And he's had the, I would say, pleasure of having a great working relationship with these guys, the team at BMO-Harris. So Jim, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, George. Appreciate that introduction. So I'm going to talk to you today about the DRD project itself. It started off, as George said, in 2012, and they had a set of goals that they wanted to achieve for data retention and data archiving. So the question is, how do you start with that? How do you prove the concept? How do you make sure it's going to be rational and implementable and productive? And so they evaluated a number of candidate projects for this first implementation, which is basically going to prove whether the concept works or not. And so they wanted to select a project with some tangible ROI. They wanted some money back from this. They wanted something that was large enough to demonstrate the practicality of the solution, and they needed to be achievable in a reasonably short period of time. They didn't want this to be a monster program. So ultimately, they selected Oracle PeopleSoft system with 3 components in it. It had general ledger, purchase orders, and asset management modules. And they said, if this project works, this is the best guidance that we have for an ongoing project to do this across our enterprise. So they set some high-level goals. They wanted to be able to extract all of that legacy data and get it archived. That was the key goal. That was a requirement, and they had to do it. But in addition to that, we want to save some money. So when they look at the ROI on that, based on the hardware costs, the software costs, the maintenance licenses, they said they were going to eliminate about $285,000 a month of ongoing costs for the life cycle of the retention period. So that had a reasonably good payback in terms of its cost. And of course, they wanted to remain compliant. They have legal requirements for keeping this data. So they wanted to keep audit trails. They wanted to make sure that all of the accesses and audit trails for both the system that was there and the ongoing system was able to track who accessed it, who saw what, and all the requirements for that.
And so talk to us about how did they decide on what format? You have to hold on to something for 40 years. We see various file formats that change over time, operating systems, platforms. What was the thinking there, and what did we end up doing? I mean, I know the answer, but.
Yeah, exactly. So that really wasn't driven as much by the customer as it was us trying to make sure they understood the implications of the data retention and the longevity. When you have something for 40 years, for example, we don't have punch cards anymore, right? So punch cards probably would not have been an ideal solution for archiving. On the other hand, A lot of the current digital formats are no longer supported over many years. CD-ROMs and other things are probably not the right technology. But the data formats itself, the technology that we provide uses XML, which is an independent format, vendor independent, and has been around for probably 30 years now. I've been involved with XML implementations. And so it's the perfect basis for describing all of the various kinds of data. It doesn't care what the data is, we can describe it with the XML technology. So clearly, BMO wanted to use this as a proof of concept for a long-term program that they could use to evaluate applications across the enterprise. So they had 4 key goals. The key goals were dramatically reduce cost. They have hardware and software and vendors maintaining stuff all over the place. And those costs are ongoing and monthly, and you can taste them, feel them, and measure them.
And I think the other thing, to your point, Todd has been a visionary, I think, and we see this in a lot of organizations where ideas get ideated out in the business, whether you're in healthcare or energy or financial services. They go in IT and they say, hey, we need a new capability. IT says, great, but that's what we're here for. And then it's just kind of ever building set of stuff that disappears in IT. The customer, whether it's internal or external, starts getting value. And over time, IT is kind of left saying, okay, now I got to upgrade this thing. We're going into the cloud. Do we want to move this in the cloud? Our hardware is getting old. There's a whole bunch of things. And so I think BMO, again, is to the point of this program, but also saying we got to stay on top of this. I mean, we've had other customers where they've said we have 18,000 servers and we actually don't know what's on them, right? And so I think BMO with this program is sort of saying we're going to keep our house in order over time and go after this relatively aggressively, right? Which I think has been really valuable to them.
Exactly right. And in this particular case, we saw a number of cases where they had actually contracted with third parties to operate and maintain these systems. So in addition to the costs associated with hardware and maintenance licenses, they had the third-party vendor costs that were necessary just to keep the lights on for the systems. So there was a serious payback for a number of the systems that you evaluate. And that was key to some of the success. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, to be successful, they said, hey, you can't just throw any old system at us here. These people have to be trained. We have to make sure they understand how to operate it and where to go to get the data. So number 2, we want you to find something that allows us to get it this easily. We want you to use familiar web-based tools. We don't want custom UIs. We don't want a lot of special development for this. We're not trying to replicate every single functionality of the original application. We just need to meet the business requirements that are necessary.
And I think that's a really good point, because one of the things I think you've seen, I've watched your team engage with, is you end up being change agents in the organization. You come to a group, we say, hey, we're going to retire this old system. And sometimes they'll say, don't take my baby away, right? I've used this for 20 years. I know it really well. Maybe the operational people don't understand the value of recovering the cost, of simplifying the infrastructure. So I think you make a really good point. If you can come in as a team and say, well, I know we did some things in a manufacturing engagement where we said, oh, we're using a green screen. And so our team re-implemented in web, something had a black background and green font. And I go, that just looks like our screen. Okay, great. And then they feel okay about it. But if you have resistance from the end user community, I think we realize that can be a barrier to moving forward.
Absolutely.
Because they're the people who run the business day to day, right?
Absolutely. And the other thing that we bring to the table is that we help them understand what they can do better. So when we work with their business analysts, we help them understand that if we just replicate what they did before, that's a business process that may not actually be the best way to do what you have to do for the data in the data retention environment. So we can simplify things, we can get them at the data that they need faster, less numbers of screens, less keystrokes, as long as we understand what are your business requirements for the use of this data after it's migrated into the data retention model.
And I think the other thing I've noticed your team doing is BMO-Harris, and I think other organizations are moving toward a more virtual workforce, right? And so now you've got this web-based application that's available with the appropriate security from, potentially not sitting in front of your cube at, with a block mode 3270 terminal. And it's like, okay, now I can run a local VPN, everything's super secure. And so again, I think you're right. Sometimes by doing this, we actually provide improved value to their operational community compared to the old legacy application.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, let me jump in for 1 second here because what we're particularly good at, I may say so, is working with clients to run these projects. And we've done so many of them over the years. Recently, we put together what's actually a pretty extensive white paper on the best practices for decommissioning and data archiving. And I wanted to mention that that white paper is available to you through the webinar. You can download that through the handouts or access that through our website. But please do take a look at that if you're interested.
Thanks, Julie. A third key milestone is to rigorously support compliance. All of the businesses that we work with are highly regulated. They have strong security requirements, privacy requirements. Our hospital customers have HIPAA laws and requirements that who can touch what and who can see things, and retention and disposal rules for legal. And George alluded to this a little bit earlier, that it's not only just getting it off the system and into an archive, but it's the ongoing disposal of that data. If I'm only supposed to keep it for 7 years, we don't want legal exposure for stuff that was supposed to be here 7 years, but we kept it longer than it was supposed to be. So now it is legally available to some entity who wants to sue us for whatever it happens to be.
And I remember, I think it was on one of the early BMO-Harris projects, that not only includes the archive, but you have to think about your DR and backup recovery scenario, because you can have an exposure that says, well, in my archive, I do my purges maybe once a quarter, and then I have an e-discovery action against me, and they come in and say, well, what about your DR zone? You're like, oh boy, I didn't think about that. Or what about my backup recovery? And then you have exposure there too. So I think one of the Todd's team and your team has said, when we do this retention policy, we think about it at enterprise level. We may touch other systems, and again, that's really some architecture, but as your point, it's really a business analyst, like what do we do to protect ourselves and to manage that risk?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And then finally, there are reports that need to be produced. And many times the users are familiar with how reports are, and we can replicate those nearly exactly the way that they need to see them for business continuity and ease of use. And oftentimes, we can also improve on those reports. Sometimes they get a lot more stuff in the reports than they actually need. And so we're able to, during this business analysis process, boil this down to what is it that you need from the DRD in order to be able to do your job. And we can produce that more efficiently and make them more productive. So what's really important here is that we base this on OpenText Info Archive. Info Archive is an enterprise-based solution that allows us to archive the data, large volumes of data, and it's extremely flexible. And so the OpenText people have years of experience of dealing with large data volumes, and we're taking advantage of both their platforms and their expertise in our partnership with them to apply these same techniques to the data archiving worlds. Basically, the Info Archive has world-class archiving capabilities. We ingest structured, and what's really important here that a lot of systems don't do is unstructured data. Unstructured data can be very complicated to manage. So our platform using XML to construct the structured data and have pointers to unstructured data allows us to take virtually data from any system and archive it. It uses a non-proprietary XML-based format. We talked about that earlier. This kind of future-proofs your data. It's in an independent, vendor non-specific format that virtually anybody can process. We don't have any dependencies on the originating applications. We translate all of that to this vendor-independent XML-based form. And using the Info Archive platform, we have centralized retention policy management. We manage how things go into, how long they're saved, and when they should be disposed of, all in one location. This platform provides data security and privacy. It uses the single sign-on and other security implementations that are available in the business, as well as built-in security applications such as auditing. And the really important part here is that over time, this data is going to grow, and you need to be able to support more than terabytes worth of data in the systems. So the OpenText platform provides us all the capabilities that were necessary. That's one of the main reasons that BMO chose the OpenText and Flatirons solution.
Yeah, and one of the things I really like about this info archive solution, as you mentioned, scales like crazy. They've got a number of financial services customers who are archiving. I don't know if it's terabytes a day, but it's definitely large numbers of gigabytes a day. But we can start up really quickly, right? In our environment, we do a build of InfoArchive every time we do a build, and that build takes 4 minutes. And at the end of 4 minutes, we have our InfoArchive sample application deployed in the cloud, ready to go. People can also run that locally in their development environment. So what I find kind of exciting and compelling is it's easy to get started. And I think that was one of the things that made the initial POC successful. BMO-Harris, as you said, it looked at a number of archiving solutions. They were looking at archiving their mail systems. They were looking at archiving legacy CMS systems and other operational systems. And a lot of those were, 4 months, and you still don't have Hello World done. With InfoArchive, it was 2 weeks. We provisioned. They're like, oh, let's see. And as you say, not only that, but it scales down and it scales up. So I think that's nice because, to your point, a lot of times we start with a relatively small application. And I think, without going into financial cost details of a vendor, I'll tell you, I think it's very approachable financially. You can start with a fairly small investment and then go over time if there's value to you. So again, that makes it easy for us because we can come into a customer and say, hey, well, let's try this, right? Easy to buy, easy to maintain. I think the other thing I've noticed, I think you've seen this too, is the operational costs. I know when we first started doing it, people would say, well, now I need another DBA, I need another sysadmin. And I think what we found and what BMO-Harris has found is it's basically a black box. I mean, the footprint of maintenance is very, very small. Obviously, you're going to be doing upgrades over time, and they take time and money. But in general, it's a very lightweight, basically a software appliance. You can run it in cloud, you can run it on-prem. That's been another thing I think that has made your teams succeed is it's not this huge heavyweight footprint to get going and to maintain.
That's right, that's right. And so all of those together BMO said, yeah, this is technology that we believe is applicable to our thing. And as George alluded to, during the initial sales cycle, they said, we're not sure we believe all this. How about doing a proof of concept? So we put together a 2-week proof of concept that brought up all the pieces and proved the throughput from ingestion through application in a 2-week lifecycle on a very small project. And they said, that was pretty impressive. So let's see what we can make it do. And that's where we went on to the initial implementation for the PeopleSoft candidate project. So this is where, after the first project, the customer said, yeah, baby, I get this. So it took us 3 months to execute the project. That was all 3 modules of the PeopleSoft. If you calculate the lifecycle savings of how long they were going to retain this data and what the costs were for maintaining the hardware, software, maintenance licenses, and upgrades necessary, we basically saved them $5 million over that lifecycle. In terms of payback, they paid back the project within 3 months of the savings that were saved from decommissioning the pieces of that application. So clearly, this was a financial win, and they said, yeah, if we can find more candidates like this, this is certainly good for our business. And success can be contagious. As soon as we finished that, and they said, that looked really nice. Let's find more. So on they went, searching for more candidates, and in fact, there were no lack of candidates. What's important, however, is to make sure you evaluate those candidates for that ROI, because not everything that you're retaining is a good fit for the data retention model. There are costs that are associated with implementation. If those costs are more than the cost that it takes to maintain some of this data, don't do that. So they've identified since then 15 more applications that we've decommissioned since then. Some were at the end of their life cycle, some were out of support, some were replaced by new systems or were the result of mergers and acquisitions. And all of those had a significant payback in terms of their return on investment. The challenge was no longer identifying the candidates, it was evaluating the candidates for their ROI, or sometimes it's not ROI, it's legal requirements. Cost is not a factor in that case. I have to do it whatever it costs.
Well, I think the other thing, and obviously people in financial services think about this every day, it's risk management, right? And so you say, hey, I've got this system. I think we see this, right? We have this system, it pretty much works. But what happens if it's failed to work right when we were in the middle of an audit? And, every day you have an old system, you have that risk. So I think you're right. There's and there's some methodologies that we've developed that we use with BMO-Harris to say, okay, let's look at operational costs. That's the other thing. And then, as you mentioned, the other big thing is there's really three things, right? Operational cost recovery is important, risk management is important, and legal compliance is important. I mean, if you miss on any three of those, you're in for a bad day.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, the other risk factor is that many of these systems are 10, 15, 20, 30 years old that they're doing. The maintenance has long since stopped, and the security exposures associated with non-maintenance of those operating systems is significant.
You run out with a day zero, thing identified in Oracle 7. Oracle 7 went out of support, 18 years ago. It was first introduced 30 years ago. And I know you and I have worked with a customer recently that's running Oracle 7. And you're like, we never thought about this. Now we've got a big problem. How do we get the data out of Oracle 7 or, whatever the issue is? We're finally going to turn it off. No one here knows Oracle 7. Oh, we waited too long. Luckily, we had support for that. We actually did a little work to get our ETL tools to run in that. But I think you're right, and we're going to steal our thunder. We got to slide on this, but yeah.
So the question is, what made these projects successful in our opinion? And basically, one of the key factors is the partnership between FDI and BMO-Harris. We have complementary skills that allow us to evaluate the projects and determine how they should be implemented and what their return on investment should be, evaluate the costs associated with implementing any particular project. And that is one of the key factors in being successful. If you just willy-nilly do it, you're not going to get the returns that you actually expect. So I think that was really key. A secondary key is that they established a small program group responsible for the coordination of the DRD program. That continuity of the skills and the knowledge that they learned doing these projects helped them counsel the stakeholders who own the actual systems that are being decommissioned. And when you can talk with them and understand what the pitfalls are and what they should be looking for, nearly every single time we go into a stakeholder and say, we want to decommission your thing, they said, well, you've got to give us everything that system could do. And that's really not what decommissioning is about. Decommissioning is about providing the minimal functional requirements for your business and legal requirements. And you don't want to spend more money than you have to. You don't want to try to re-engineer the original system. And so with a good set of business analysts as a core team, understanding that's the goal, and here are the pitfalls, and here's the technology we're implementing it in, using that, the projects that are selected are successful.
Right, and I think it's it's a testimony to BMO-Harris and their culture of collaboration, of teamwork, of let's make sure we're doing good thing for BMO-Harris the business, let's make sure it's a good thing for our customers and for our employees. And so I think it's been interesting and kind of fun to watch. They walk around they walk around the internal stakeholders and they say, hey, here's some money under a rock. They're like, what are you talking about? Oh yeah, that money you're spending over there on the rock, I can take that away and give it back to you to do innovation, to go into new markets, to change the way you do online banking, to provide maybe more geographic outreach, because I just gave you all this money. You were spending all this money on a legacy system without increasing your IT spend. I now have enabled you to go provide more value to so I think they've done a good job of advocating that internally. And again, to your point, someone will say, oh, we have a system that has 150 security groups. When you go in the archive, you have to reproduce this. And I'm like, well, we have pretty good security. We could do that. But I think you've been good at leading and saying, really? 150? How many people are going to access? Well, maybe 3 different roles. In the old world, we've got thousands of users and all these fine-grained roles are doing updates or doing integrations. That's not the world we're moving towards. And so again, I think your team, they're change agents, right? You're educating these people. Let's get simple over here so we can do the new things over there that are going to add more value and are going to be more fun for you than having to maintain this old thing that you can't get bug fixes for. You have to maintain old hardware. We're kind of taking all that, giving you more opportunities. So I think the culture is a big piece of it.
Well, and as you address the project, they learn things about their own systems that they didn't really know because they never looked hard enough. And for example, in a lot of cases, one person is the only person who ever goes and responds to the requests for information from those systems. Oh yeah, Sally does that. Okay, I guess we don't need 200 groups.
Right.
Yeah, well, we turned half of those off, but other people might have to have access. Well, how many times have somebody else other than Sally done that? None. Okay, then we probably don't need to build the infrastructure to service that many people. So there's lots of things they learn about the applications as they go through the process of determining what is it I really need from the decommission system.
We're going to now start to wrap up, and then we'll get over into questions. I think if we look at success factors that we've noticed, and the next slide is success factors that BMO-Harris noticed. Balancing skills and working together, I think, is super important. We talked about the need for this to be strategic and ongoing program. Team continuity is important. We see this as valuable. It does take a little time to learn the rhythm, learn how to work with people. Investment was not huge to begin with, but really one of the fun things has been, we started this almost 7 years ago, and BMO-Harris would run into a product need, and they talk to us like, well, we don't have enough product. Like, oh boy, we really need that. And they talk to the Info Archive development team, and they're like, okay, you're really a flagship customer for us. In 2012, they were one of the early adopters. And, the credit of the Info Archive engineering team and product management team, they said, that makes really good sense. And so I think part of what's been fun for us, it's really been this kind of three-legged stool of BMO-Harris providing internal business expertise and internal IT operational expertise, and then a combination of open text and FDI providing vendor and specialists in archiving and large-scale data systems, I think. And again, we think that, they chose some very good technology. We think we're very good at this as well. And the BMO-Harris team has been very good at running the program. We've seen projects not succeed so well. Mostly, it's a mix. You can fail on any of those. You can fail on a bad technology choice. You can fail on a bad vendor relationship. And you can fail on a bad internal program execution. So all three of those we think are very important. So if we talk about the sum, we talk about a fair amount of data. And I would say, the other interesting thing, Jim, if we look at our other customers over this period of time, we wouldn't view 4 terabytes as an extremely large amount of data. But again, I think it's a testimony to BMO-Harris of, to your point, picking applications that provided real value. I mean, that's a significant number. I mean, $10 to $15 million over 7 years of just giving money back and to the organization is really significant. So I think internally, this looks like a really, really good program for BMO-Harris, and it's why they've continued onward with it, and it's been fun to be part of.
And what's important about that chart is that, as you say, the amount of data isn't what provides value. The value is all of the rest of the pieces around the data. Mm-hmm. It's the maintenance costs, it's your IT support, it's the hardware, it's the rental of the building that you're putting stuff in, freeing up space. All of those things go into that return on investment. So it's not a simple calculation that says, oh, I got 4 terabytes of data. Oh, that should be really good. That's not really how you evaluate these things.
Right. Yeah. So we like the fact that, and we care a lot about, it's scaling really well. We think that the product and the designs we have, but I think your point is really spot on. So the BMO-Harris team put together this slide for us, which I wanted to share with you, and there are really 6 points we want to sort of chat about for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get into questions. One of the things when we go in and we talk to people, we say, hey, Julie, you have a system that looks old, and we see risk there where other customers have retired a similar system. And she'll say, I've already CapExed all of it. I'm not paying maintenance. I've got one person. That person's a total rock star. I don't see the value. And, let's just leave it alone. And we say, well, there's risk there. What happens, to your point, what happens if Sally takes a new job or Sally retires or whatever? If Sally changes her job, now you lose all her expertise. You have a hardware problem. And you buy a new piece of hardware, and that doesn't work with the operating system. And then you go to upgrade the operating system, and the operating system breaks the end. And then 2 weeks after that happens, you have an audit where you have to show some regulatory agency that you have the data. And now you're broken at 3 levels. The app doesn't run, the operating system doesn't run, the hardware doesn't run, and your domain expert left. And that's a bad place to be. And that's all because do nothing has low risk. So do nothing is actually significantly risky. So I think that the BMO folks recognize that. Extract, transform, and load is the process we refer to of starting from a source system, ETLing into the final system. And it's a process, as Jim said. Let's say you have 2 terabytes. It's a new data model for you. You're not quite sure how you want to look at it. you might do that sample ETL a number of times before you really get done with it. Or you might ETL 3 systems this year, and then a year from now, get 5 more systems that are just like it. You have to rev up that system again. ETL takes time. You have to have a process for that. And I can remember Jim and the BMO team developing the process. What happens if we're 200 chunks into a 3 terabyte extraction and we have a network partition? What happens? And Jim's like, well, what I know, what I don't want to have happen is to start over, right? And so you got to figure out checkpointing. You got to have basically transactional integrity in the chain. And I remember you, Jim, working with both the BMO team and the Open Archive implementation product engineering team saying, hey, we have to be able to have checkpoints. We have to have chain of custody so we can find out if we missed anything. 3 terabytes is a lot to find. You're not going to do that by looking around in the file system on your own. It's too big for humans to do without some automation. Again, security is super important to Bank of Montreal. They're a bank. They've got lots of, I mean, that's sort of how their DNA is, but also a lot of regulatory requirements on them. And we already talked about this a little bit, is simplify where you can, right? If you look at, and we do a lot of security consulting, if you look at most threat vectors for security penetrations and security failures, it's all tied to human failure due to complexity, right? Oh, I didn't understand that when I changed the port on Tomcat, suddenly now someone could come in and run a web root, script against my whole system. Oh, I didn't understand when I changed this Active Directory entry, I was opening up the world for this, or I ramped it down too much and I broke everything. So I think, again, simplicity is a good coaching. Stuff that's simpler is easier to evaluate. Where possible, we like commonality, right? Some of our customers are very geographically distributed, but again, it's all about the keep it simple approach. I think another point that we kind of alluded to, but BMO-Harris, I think, felt very strongly about is you're having great success, you retire your first app, you make some money, everyone thinks, oh, it's great, Julie, you were successful. Jim's program isn't doing so well, he's one of your peers, I want Jim to do what you did. And Jim's like, okay, Julie, prove yourself. I have 3 terabytes. I need this provision by the end of the summer. If your thing is so great, show me. You're like, holy smokes, I don't have 3 terabytes provisioned. I have 1 terabyte provisioned because that's all I knew. Now I'm, the famous person who's done great archiving. You go to your IT team, you're like, well, 3 terabytes, we might not have that. We might have to buy new hardware, or we might have to go to our cloud provisioner. So again, I think planning for expansion early is important because these things have a lead time. I've watched Jim's team say, well, we're ready to go. And then other customers will say, well, it's going to be 2 months until we have the hardware provisioned. And now we've spun up a delivery team. Maybe the customer's got scheduled deadlines, the business, and then IT comes back and says, oh, I'm sorry, we can't meet your deadline just because of procurement delays, right? Especially if you've outsourced your IT. You go to your outsourced provider and like, gee, for that, it's going to be, 2 quarters. And you have to go through an approval process. So expansion early is important to plan for. And again, we alluded to this with our great mythical peer, Sally. People leave, right? They change jobs. And sometimes there is only one person. And if they've been in the application a long time, they might be like, hey, I've decided to play golf full time, right? I'm retiring and I love BMO-Harris, or I love, customer or vendor of choice, but I'm leaving. And then they walk out the door and you lose all this expertise.
So we had one customer that had an application decommissioning project, and their only driver was the one COBOL programmer that still knew how to operate that system and get stuff out of it for their legal requirements, had a retirement date 3 months in the future. And so they knew that once he was gone, there was no way to get anything back out of that system. So it wasn't a cost factor. This wasn't a part of, oh, well, let's evaluate all the other things and see if this is a candidate. It was a candidate by definition. So it's really important to have those SMEs around so that they can describe for us what those requirements are and the weirdness, because many times these companies modify the out-of-the-box vendor programs. And so what are those things? What's different? What's unusual? What do we have to look out for when we're doing this decommissioning process? They're very valuable for that.
Absolutely. So at this point in time, we've chatted for a bit. This has been great, Jim. It's only fun to chat with you and Julie about this. We're not super maybe exciting at cocktail parties, but when it comes to talking about this stuff, we're pretty passionate, and you're a great team to work with. And I know the folks at BMO-Harris enjoy working with Jim, and they've enjoyed the relationship, I think,
Yes, thank you, George. So it looks like a question about projects like this. Where do they reside in an organization? And can you talk to who owns a data archiving and application decommissioning project, and who else is involved?
Yeah, I think typically what we've seen, again, it's back to the partnership, but really most times it sits inside the IT organization because they understand the infrastructure, or they understand the cost, they have access to the technology, but all of them are really have to be driven in concert with, a CFO or, potentially a chief legal officer. We've seen situations where a legal officer will come in an organization, a compliance officer say, wow, we've got compliance risk here, whether, it's a new regulatory requirement around disclosure or whatever. So I think it sits in IT, but again, what we see is that partnership is very important. If IT is just buried saying, hey, we're just going to start turning off systems and see who complains, and I know that sounds funny and silly, but we've had customers who have done that. They're like, we don't have a process. That's an old machine running AIX on an old piece of hardware on a RISC 6000. We're going to turn it off and see who complains. I mean, that's not a great way to have a relationship between IT. If no one complains in a week, it was probably okay. If everyone screams, at least we know now who was using it, right? So we talked to them. We're like, well, that's not a great way to build trust from business. You're going to walk in each day and figure out, we'll have data center consolidation where we've had people who at board levels would say, hey, Julie, we're turning off that building in Maryland. You have 6 months to turn it off, and you're running IT. You're like, who is using that? Right? It's an old system. I got to figure out who all the stakeholders are and go to them and say, hey, look, we're going to recover, $1 million a quarter by getting out of this property. I need your help. And so you go to Jim as the business partner, and Jim says, okay, well, I've got these 4 apps and they do these things. And if I lose access to them, I can't run the business. So I think it's a combination. Typically it lives inside IT, but has a tight, a lot of times, what IT will do is say, again, here, I can give you money, but I might need a change in how I get funded to get that done. Sometimes IT can just fund it out of their additional run rate. Other times they go to the business and say, here's the case. Let's go get money for this project. And so it depends on where they are in their funding. And I think finally what we see is sometimes, as we mentioned, it's hooked to other initiatives. You'll say, hey, risk compliance has gone through, and they've told us anything that's older than 10 years, we really need to look hard at, because our security officer is telling us huge amount of risk on old systems, old versions of Java, old versions of the operating system, old databases, things that are really opportunities for black hats to come in and do damage to us, hard to patch. Other times it'll be a real estate change. We're leaving the state. We're not doing business in the state anymore. We're getting rid of or we're getting out of a country even. So there's some business drivers as well that drive down into the organization.
Right. Okay, good, thanks. So here's one I think probably for Jim, just in terms of, and you've talked to some of these along the way, in terms of the technical aspects about a project. Are there certain technical challenges that are common or some that are unusual, and how do you tend to address these?
Yeah, the technical challenges are typically about the data models that are associated with specific and unique projects. So homegrown projects are typically the most difficult. There's usually documentation associated around the data models. So that's why when we talked about having the subject matter experts around, that's really key, especially for these homegrown systems that fall into the archiving.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I watched your system, team say, okay, it's Oracle Financials. We know Oracle Financials. Are you running EBS 11 or EBS 12? There's 300 tables in this one, there's 350 tables in that one, we know them. But, more than once, we say, well, we had this Fox Pro application. It was built by Bob. Bob left 15 years ago. It runs on Windows NT. We've upgraded it so it limps along on Windows 2003 server. Now that's gone out of support. What do we do? So again, I've watched your team do some amazing things we refer to as kind of like archaeology, right? You're doing SQL traces. You're looking at file system traces. But risk goes down, velocity goes up when you say, hey, Julie, you've sat in this app, or maybe Julie's the DBA, and she says, okay, I've seen that app, I've done data dumps, I understand the data model, and then it's like, oh, great, okay, now we can go fast, because here's the only tables we ever use. All these other tables are junk. We don't need to turn those into reports. So I think SME access, I know, lowers your blood pressure, right? And
Totally.
and ups the velocity and lowers the risk.
Exactly.
Yep.
And the cost.
And the cost, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I have one more question here, and maybe George, kick it back to you in terms of, today we've talked about BMO-Harris and they're in financial services, but, a lot of the concepts and the drivers behind projects like this, you said, mergers or acquisitions, risk and compliance are applicable to other industries. So could you speak a little bit more about maybe a couple of examples of what we've done with other customers, or speak to how this touches cross-industry?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it in your intro that we tend to work in industries that have regulatory compliance. I mean, we haven't yet seen, and we've done a lot of work in retail we do stuff in digital asset management, but the retail customers tend to not have this big a driver for retention policies. Like, hey, we did stuff with JCPenney. They're not really super interested in seeing what they did 15 years ago on something. They might, but it's not there. But if you're in oil and gas, and we have oil and gas customers who have subway drawings from the 1890s, right? And they're like, we need to know where the natural gas line that was put in 50 years ago, because we're going to be drilling there, and it's on microfiche, or it's on vellum, or it's on an old drawing. I mean, we did stuff with up in East Lansing with Michigan State, and they had drainage systems from the 1880s, and like, we need to retire this stuff because it's all around. MSU is growing as a university, and they have a thing where, wow, we just cut a gas line, we never knew it was there. That was bad. Let's not do that again, right? Or again, we've worked with power plants, and whether you're nuclear or coal or oil, those regulatory industries come in and say, we need to see your X-ray fluoroscopy from 25 years ago, because most pipes at this age are going to need replacement. And so if you're not replacing, you better prove to me you've had continuity of inspection and you've been doing borehole inspections. Same thing in aerospace. Obviously,
healthcare is really
healthcare. Yeah, talk about healthcare for a minute, right?
Yeah. Healthcare is really big, both from a business and patient continuity perspective. Doctor wants to look back at the history of a patient. Well, if they've gone through 3 hospitals and 2 clinics, and where is all that data? How do I get access to it? And today it's very complicated, even if they maintain these old systems. Okay, I want to go see her history. Well, I got to go look up data in clinic A. I got to go see her records from hospital B. That makes it very difficult, and it's costly for them to maintain those other systems.
Well, and we've seen examples of people that have violated HIPAA by it's not so much that they disclose, but they can't provide you as a patient. So there are HIPAA rules around hey, I'm moving to England.
Your records.
I want all my records. And people have been fined in the 7 digits for breach of information, but also not being able to say, hey, I'm sorry, Julie, you had orthoscopic surgery on your shoulder 10 years ago. We can't tell you what that is. And you're like, what? My shoulder really hurts. I want to have surgery. I need this. Or like, we don't have it. And then you're like, okay, well, that's not okay. So I think healthcare, oil and gas, manufacturing, all.
Yeah, and another one that I see is around GDPR requirements. We don't talk a lot about that, but at least from what I do within the company, we see a lot of people reading this white paper we did with OpenText on GDPR and data archiving. And so that, again, is another aspect I see, especially in financial services, because it impacts data of any European Union resident.
Well, I think you're right in that financial services, other verticals are global organizations. So, you're in a situation where you have a French subsidiary and someone is in France and they leave the company, and you have to be able to prove that you've purged all their data from your system. And that person worked for a year in your Chicago office. As far as I know, that still applies, right? And so now you've got a French subsidiary saying, look, we have to be able to prove if we get audited that we've been in compliance with GDPR, even though, that data might have been sitting in a US-based organization, or if you're cloud-based, obviously that stuff's global. So I think you're right. We don't see so much of that in the United States now. Obviously that went into effect last April, I think, but it's coming for sure.
Okay, great. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and wrap it up. I have so much fun on days like today because I get to spend time, hearing George talk about what we do, and more importantly, have people like Jim in the room.
More important?
Well, come on, George, you're a great asset.
Okay, all right, okay. We're now bowing. If you're in the room, we can see we're bowing to Jim.
Yeah.
It's awesome project.
Well, no, and the reason I say that is because, you know, our people are our product largely, in that, you know, Jim is working with customers, and, you know, I appreciate that you're spending your time talking about, you know, one of our best clients and the great work that we're doing together. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for dialing in today. We will. And
one more thank you to our great team at BMO-Harris.
Yes.
I imagine at some point they'll be listening if they're not online right now. I think they're all off in their schedule conflict. But hey, to the BMO-Harris team, if you listen to this, thank you so much for your business. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you to BMO, and we will be in touch with the link to the recording. And if you have any questions before then, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is there at fdiinc.com. And we look forward to potentially having the opportunity to work with you at some point in the near future. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.